Today we're covering one of the most disturbing and infamous cases in Australian criminal history, the Snowtown murders, also known as the bodies in barrels case. This story involves multiple murders, complex motivations, and a chilling discovery that shocked the nation.
Tonight, it's already Australia's worst serial killing, and it's not over yet.
Body number 10 has been found buried in the backyard of a house.
Police now fear the toll could rise to at least 12.
The Snowtown murders took place in South Australia during the 1990s. The case is named after the small town of Snowtown, where police made a horrifying discovery in 1999, 6 bodies hidden in barrels inside an abandoned bank vault. But the story begins long before that shocking find. To understand this case, we need to look at the key people involved. The murders were primarily orchestrated by John Bunting, who is often described as the ringleader. Bunting was joined by Robert Wagner, James Vlassakis, and Mark Haydon, all of whom played roles in the brutal killings. John Bunting was the mastermind behind the murders. Described as a charismatic and manipulative figure, Bunting harbored a deep hatred for pedophiles, homosexuals, and those he considered to be weak or undesirable. He used this hatred to justify his actions, recruiting others into his twisted mission. Robert Wagner, a longtime friend of Bunting, shared his violent tendencies and became his most trusted accomplice. James Vlassakis, who was just a teenager when the killings began, was drawn into Bunting's circle and became an active participant. Mark Haydon, although less involved in the actual killings, played a significant role in covering up the crimes and disposing of the bodies. Between 1992 and 1999, Bunting and his accomplices were responsible for the deaths of 12 people. Each murder was premeditated, with victims often being tortured before their deaths. The brutality of these crimes was deeply disturbing, and the perpetrators showed no remorse. Let's take a closer look at the victims, whose lives were tragically cut short by this vicious group. Each had their own story, and it's important to remember them not just as victims, but as individuals who were taken from their families and communities. However, as you will soon become aware, some of the victims had their own disturbing pasts. Clinton Douglas Trezisa was the first known victim of the Snowtown murders. Clinton Trezisa was bludgeoned to death with a shovel in John Bunting's living room after being invited inside for a social visit. John accused Clinton of being a pedophile and referred to him in conversations after his murder as Happy Pants. Clinton was found buried 2 years after his murder in a shallow grave on the 16th of August 1994 at Lower Light, South Australia. It was another 3 years before Bunting murdered again. Ray Allen Peter Davies was an intellectually disabled man who was the second known victim of the Snowtown murders. At some point in 1995, Bunting admitted to James Jamie Vlassakis that he had killed a man named Ray Davies. He recounted how the Vlassakis' own mother, Elizabeth Harvey, wife of John Bunting, had stabbed Davies in the leg just before their mutual friend Robert Wagner strangled the man to unconsciousness with jumper cables. Years later, in court testimony, Vlassakis stated that according to Bunting's story, Bunting and Wagner loaded Davies' unconscious form into the trunk of a Holden Torana. They drove 90 minutes to the northeast to a residence in the town of Bakara. They tossed Davies into a bathtub and proceeded to bash him in the genitals with the end of a pole, which is believed to have ultimately resulted in the man's death. On the 26th of May 1999, the body of Ray Davies was found in a hole at the rear of the premises that Bunting had previously occupied. The hole was filled in by Bunting and Wagner with bricks, soil, and concrete. Suzanne Allen, 47, was found buried at Bunting's house at Salisbury North on May 23, 1999, wrapped in 11 different plastic bags. Bunting concealed her death, and he continued to collect her pension, claiming a total of $17,000. Bunting claimed she had died of a heart attack, although law enforcement suspected that she was murdered when her relationship with Bunting deteriorated. Murder charges regarding the death of Allen were eventually dropped by the prosecution due to lack of evidence, and the perpetrators were tried but not found guilty as a result of a hung jury. Her case was never tried again. Michelle Gardner, formerly Michael James Gardner, was an Australian transgender woman who was killed by John Bunting and Robert Wagner. Shortly before her disappearance in September 1997, Gardner was playing with Wagner's de facto's children in her front yard. Gardner grabbed one of the children and placed her hand over the child's mouth. Wagner saw the incident and became infuriated. Whereas previously he had tolerated Gardner and would mumble an occasional hello, now he was ropeable and refused to acknowledge his neighbor. Bunting and Wagner took her to Murray Bridge, where they strangled her in a shed, forcing her to stand up each time she collapsed. Wagner and Bunting staged a robbery at Michelle's home, stealing some of Miss Zarita's belongings and convincing her that Gardner had stolen them in order to pay for a sex change operation. Gardner's body was kept in the barrel in the shed until it was moved to the Snowtown bank vault. Vanessa Lane, formerly Barry Wayne Lane, was an Australian transgender woman who was killed by John Bunting and Robert Wagner. She was a convicted paedophile. The former girlfriend questioned Bunting about Lane's claims, and he admitted they were true. Around the same time, Thomas Trevelyan told Bunting that Lane had been sexually abusing him. When Bunting found out that Lane had been talking to people about Bunting's previous crimes, Bunting was concerned that she would admit the crimes to the police. On the 17th of October 1997, Bunting, Wagner, and Trevelyan picked up Lane. Early the following morning, Lane's mother received a phone call from her. On orders from Bunting, Lane verbally abused her mother, who could hear Trevelyan in the background prompting her with what to say. After telling her mother she was moving to Queensland and wanted nothing further to do with her, she hung up. They then took Lane to her fiancé's home, where they tortured her for details of her bank accounts. After crushing her toes with pliers, she was strangled to death. After Lane's murder, Bunting assumed control of Lane's vehicle and claimed her welfare payments. Lane's body was kept in a barrel in the shed until it was moved to the Snowtown bank vault. Police investigating the disappearance of Lane discovered that a withdrawal was being made from Lane's account at an automatic teller machine at the same service station every pension day. They installed surveillance cameras and got footage of Wagner making the withdrawals. Due to his links with Bunting, both were now put under surveillance. Thomas Eugenio Trevelyan was an Australian man who was killed by John Bunting and Robert Wagner. Thomas Trevelyan shared a house with Vanessa Lane for a period of 5 months from April to October 1997. Trevelyan had assisted Bunting and Wagner in the earlier murder of Vanessa Lane, which he had moved in with Wagner after Lane's death, but Wagner's girlfriend did not like him. On November 4, 1997, Wagner's girlfriend's son was playing with a puppy when Trevelyan began chasing it in an attempt to kill the puppy with his knife. He was stopped. But that afternoon, Bunting told others that Trevelyan had started to fuck up and go mental, and that he would be a risk. Trevelyan was driven to Kersbrook in the Adelaide Hills by Bunting and Wagner. He was forced to stand on a box while a noose was fastened around his neck, and the box kicked from under him. The next day, Trevelyan was found hanging from a tree in Humbug Scrub in the Adelaide Hills near Kersbrook. Given his history of past suicide attempts, the coroner found Trevelyan had committed suicide. Gavin Allen Porter was an Australian man who was also murdered by John Bunting and Robert Wagner. Both Vlassakis and Porter were heroin addicts. After Bunting, Elizabeth Harvey and her children, including Vlassakis, moved to Murray Bridge in late 1997. Porter also moved with them. Bunting referred to Porter, a heroin addict, as a waste who no longer deserved to live. Bunting decided he should be the next victim after he was pricked by a discarded syringe Porter had left on the couch in the living room. Porter was attacked by Bunting and Wagner while sleeping in his car parked on the property. But he awoke and managed to stab Bunting in the hand with a screwdriver before being overpowered and strangled. Vlassakis was shown Porter's body before it was disposed of in a barrel. Troy Yude, born in 1977, was James Vlassakis' half-brother. Bunting believed Troy had molested Vlassakis as a child, although this was never proven. One night, Bunting and Wagner woke Vlassakis and told him they were going to get Yude. They beat Yude while he was asleep in bed, and then Vlassakis handcuffed him while the others tied him up. They then dragged Yude out of bed and put him in a bath where they beat him again and forced him to give them his financial details. Yude was told to address them by names like Sir, God, Master, and Chief Inspector, and crushed his toes with pliers if he failed to use the correct name for one of them. Bunting now got Yude to repeat a series of numbers, words and phrases which he recorded, after which Yude was strangled to death and his body was later placed in a barrel. Using a program called SoundForge, Bunting used the recording to create messages from Yude and later from future victims, telling friends that they were going away. Frederick Fred Robert Brooks met a tragic end in September 1998. His fate was one of horrendous and sadistic torture, mutilation, and was finally killed by John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Vlassakis. Bunting became obsessed with the idea that Brooks was inappropriately touching young girls and repeatedly told the others that something had to happen to him. One day in September 1998, Brooks was excited as he had been notified that morning that he had been accepted into the Air Force Cadets. He was invited to a party that night, but was also invited to join Bunting, Wagner, and Vlassakis in a break and enter. So he accepted their offer instead. Vlassakis, Wagner, and Bunting tortured the young Brooks in a bathtub. As with previous victims, he was handcuffed and thumb-cuffed. They beat and tortured him and forced him to call them by vaunted titles. Lit cigarettes were inserted into his ears and his nostrils and left to smolder. A lit sparkler was shoved up his urethra. He was made to speak into a recording device, including his banking information and that he had molested young girls. A syringe was used multiple times to inject various substances into his testicles, which were wired to a variac, sending electrical impulses through his body. His toes were crushed by pliers. Finally, a rag was stuffed into his mouth, and he was beaten until his body gave up. His corpse was wrapped in plastic, then thrown into the trunk of a car. Brooks's brutalized body was eventually found in a barrel in the Snowtown bank vault. Gary O'Dwyer met a similar fate in October 1998. He was another who fell victim to John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Vlassakis. In October 1998, Bunting enlisted the aid of Vlassakis to gain relevant information about the financial circumstances of O'Dwyer and whether he had any family. O'Dwyer was considered a financial target due to his income from disability assistance. On the day of the murder, Vlassakis was intending to go to a party. However, at the insistence of Bunting, Vlassakis arranged with O'Dwyer for a couple of friends, namely Bunting, Wagner, and Vlassakis, to have a drink with O'Dwyer. Bunting set out to get O'Dwyer drunk, and after approximately 15 to 20 minutes, Wagner grabbed O'Dwyer around the throat. O'Dwyer immediately went into some sort of fit. Bunting told Wagner to ease off a bit and handcuffs were applied. Physical violence and torture followed. Then, after having spoken falsehoods into a recording device, he was murdered. The body was taken to Mark Haydon's home, where it was placed in a barrel. On May 20, 1999, O'Dwyer's body was found in a barrel in the Snowtown bank vault. Elizabeth Haydon was killed by John Bunting and Robert Wagner. Elizabeth Haydon found herself alone when, on November 21, 1998, Bunting and Wagner called at her residence. Her husband and children had gone out for the night. Bunting told his girlfriend that Elizabeth had made sexual advances to him and he had turned her down. Elizabeth was dragged to her bathroom, tortured, then killed. A rope was left around her neck and a gag had been taped into her mouth. Purportedly later that day, when her husband was shown her remains, he laughed. On May 20th, 1999, Haydon's body was found in a barrel in the Snowtown bank vault. David Johnson, and also fell victim to John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Vlassakis. It had been almost 6 months since the last murder, and Bunting began talking about getting Johnson. He suggested that Vlassakis find a way to lure him to the bank in Snowtown. On May 9th, 1999, Vlassakis told Johnson that there was a computer for sale cheap in Snowtown, and Johnson agreed to go with Vlassakis to buy it. As soon as he entered the building, he was seized, and the ritual of beatings, torture, and voice recording began. Bunting also played his voices from the Dead mixtape. After obtaining his ATM details, Wagner and Vlassakis took Johnson's ATM card to a roadhouse in Port Wakefield to withdraw some cash, but the machine printed out a message saying, "Not authorized," cancelled. They returned to Snowtown, assuming the account had no money in it. By then, Johnson was already dead. Bunting explained that Johnson had gotten free and threatened him with a knife, so he had no choice but to overpower and kill him. Wagner then cut a piece of flesh from Johnson's body, and the trio later returned to Adelaide, where Wagner and Bunting cooked and ate the flesh. These murders were not just about killing, they involved systematic torture and a disturbing level of cruelty. The killers, especially Bunting and Wagner, derived a perverse satisfaction from inflicting pain on their victims. They recorded details of their victims' suffering and even mocked them during the torture. The discovery of the bodies in Snowtown was the result of a long and complex investigation. Police had been following leads on a missing persons case when they were directed to Snowtown. Inside the abandoned bank vault, they found 6 barrels containing the remains of 8 victims. The stench and sight inside that vault were described by investigators as something they would never forget. The case quickly became one of Australia's most infamous, with details of the murders shocking the public. The media dubbed it the Bodies in Barrels case, and the trial that followed was one of the longest and most complex in Australian history. The trial revealed the full extent of the horrors these men inflicted. Bunting was found to be the leader, orchestrating the killings with cold precision. Wagner was his right-hand man, participating in nearly all of the murders. Vlassakis, though younger, was complicit in several killings and helped lure victims to their deaths. Haydon, while less directly involved, assisted in covering up the crimes and disposing of the bodies. In 2003, Bunting and Wagner were convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Vlassakis, who cooperated with the police and provided crucial evidence, was sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 26 years. Mark Haydon was also convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison for his role in the murders. Shockingly, in February 2024, Mark Haydon was granted parole, with authorities citing his excellent behavior in prison. He was released in April and is residing at the Adelaide Pre-Release Centre in Northfield as part of the conditions for his parole. The Snowtown murders are a grim reminder of the capacity for human cruelty. The motivations behind these killings were complex, involving a mix of hatred, manipulation, and a misguided sense of justice. Bunting's ability to recruit others into his twisted scheme highlights the dangers of charismatic individuals who prey on the vulnerable. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more Australian true crime content. And as always, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What other true crime stories from Australia would you like to hear about?